Hey guys, all of the Vanguard boys here, bringing you a brand new video series today where we discuss and dissect the decks of standard format and kind of where some of our favorite decks started and where they have come, peaked, maybe even what the decks could be like in the future. And today I want to start off with my favorite deck in this format, which is Hexaorb Sorceress. Now, to give a brief overview of what Hexaorb Sorceress is, she is based on the Oracle Think Tank gameplay style where a lot of their decks do top deck manipulation, gain effect based off of triggers, and various other structures like that. Simply how the ride line works, you go from your 0 to grade 1, nothing happens. You go to the grade 2, you're able to counterblast 1 to draw a card, and when you go from 2 to 3, which is your Hexaorb Sorceress, you're able to check for the top deck of your cards, rearrange them, top 3 cards, and then of course during your drive checks when you hit a trigger, you're able to give 10,000k to additional rearguard, which does include the booster behind Hexaorb Sorceress if you are boosting her. And during your Persona Ride turns, you're able to counterblast 1, soul blast 1, take a trigger from your hand, and put it on top and gain triple drive, which is a very powerful ability, which is unfortunately locked behind a Persona Ride, which, and I'll get to that, was pretty inconsistent at grabbing. Now, so this is how I want to break down the deck. I think the philosophy behind Hexaorb Sorceress in a standard format can be broken down to two types of card design. You have top deck manipulation and a when trigger. What that means is when you have a trigger is checked during your drive check, certain cards gain different abilities, whether it's gaining power or, restanding your units, or creating other additional effects. So far from what we've seen in sets 1 through 4, this seems to be the support behind Hexaorb Sorceress. So Hexaorb Sorceress came out in DBT01, the very, very first set. And what drew me to the set was the fact that during the V Premium format, before becoming V Premium, one of the decks I love playing is Battle Sisters, and I even made a Battle Sister Premium deck, which what I would probably say is my strongest Premium deck. As much as I love my Angel Feather Premium deck, I know that Battle Sisters is way stronger. But again, that's what drew me to Hexaorb versus playing Bastion, which is a deck I thought I was going to end up maining during the standard format. So in set 1, you really only had 2 cards that could check the top of the deck consistently. Pentagleam Sorceress, who in my opinion is still a staple to this day of the deck, where it simply says on play, set top card of your deck and put it on top or bottom. Very similar to Battle Sister Coco in the original Battle Sister deck when it first came out. And what some of the cards can, even the Mage's cards can do. Just simply trigger, no, put it to bottom, and she gains 2k. The other one is Divine Sister Tartan, who she was Soul Blast on play. Rest her, and you can check top 2 cards of your deck and put 1 on top and 1 on the bottom. Which probably what they wanted to do is they wanted to prevent that from becoming such a powerful ability in the first set, even though that decks like Bastion were way stronger with their ability to restand and gain 40k columns with cards like Oline. And then the other notable card from the set that you would play in the set would be a card like Divine Sister Lapisto, who both of these cards are based off of Battle Sisters, which is really cool, that when you check a trigger, so this is again a very good way of dissecting the when trigger effects, you're able to counterblast 2, restand her, and she gains 5k. And she was easily one of my favorite cards in the first set, even though counterblast 2 to restand is kind of a heavy cost. So this is where we get into DBT02, where I think the deck really started to come alive with what I argue is probably the best card in the deck, and that is grade 2 Oline. Oline has 2 abilities. The first ability is a top deck manipulation. On play, Soul Blast 1, take a top of the look at 2 cards of your deck, and you can put, both on top, both on bottom, 1 on top, 1 on bottom. Incredibly powerful. He is, to this day, your best top deck checker outside of Hexaorb's first ability. And you could even argue the ability to put on bottom is even better. But one of the reasons why I think he works really well in this deck is because his second ability is a when trigger effect. When you hit a trigger, counterblast 1, he gains 10k. Now, normally, counterblast for extra power isn't something that I would say is very good. But with this deck, since you can give 10k to an additional rearguard, a single trigger could easily turn into a 30k trigger. During a Persona Ride, Oline with 1 trigger, all effects put on him, and his skill used once is swinging for 50k. And if your opponent already, used a lot of guard on Hexaorb to prevent being killed, Oline will be able to follow up and pretty much get the job done. So fantastic card, and that's the kind of card I want to see going forward. The other card you got is this where it exposes the biggest weakness of the deck, which is Dyeglass. Dyeglass is counterblast, discard a card, look at the top 2 cards of your deck, and you can call them out or you can put them on top. And the calling them out to the field is deceivingly not as powerful as you would think it is. While I do love that effect and it does help you kind of plus if you see 2 units during that time and no triggers. What happens when you see 2 triggers and checking the triggers are a lot more important than calling out units to the board? Then you just lost a card in your hand. And right now, this deck does not have a way of plussing. It's actually one of the reasons from set 1, my favorite Tekken choice is Painkiller Angel, because, you know, after the end of the battle, Soul Blast 1, retire her, draw a card. You get to draw a card, sure, you have to retire her, but that plays around decks like Prison, decks that gain advantage by retiring Leonard, who is a huge problem for a deck like Hexaorb, but you're not able to draw as much as other decks can, and so when you have to discard a card from your hand, you lose possible shields, you lose possible units that you would have called out anyways, and so that one you kind of risk, and that's why I only run her at 2 in my current, what I consider optimal build. But still, those 2 helped out the deck kind of gain a cohesive strategy and kind of seeing where the deck was starting to go. Now, this is where, you know, it still wasn't as strong as like what Bruce was doing. Bruce got Leonard during that set, which was insane. They got cards that can supercharge their soul. And while that set in general was pretty weak for Keter Sanctuary in general, the support for Bastion was incredibly weak besides getting an order to gain them triple drive. Like I said, just with DBT02, getting Oline was great, but Dyeglass wasn't as good as what the deck probably needed. But still, that deck Oline made the deck incredibly scary and very effective. Now we get into DBT03, which came out more recently, just a couple months ago, and we're already going to get into set 4. This is where I think the set took off. Like this is the set's best support, and I think so far this is where the deck has peaked, considering how much set 4 power creeps the format. So one of the biggest weaknesses of the deck is that Hexaorb's best skill to gain triple drive and stack a critical trigger or front trigger is locked to Persona Right. So Totres, grade 1, counterblast, add a Hexaorb to your hand. I think that's great. Just searches out from the deck, adds to your hand, incredibly powerful. The limit is that you have to be on Hexaorb when you do it, so you can't do it during your grade 2 turn, which I wish you could, but I understand what they're trying to go for, and it kind of conflicts with Hexaorb's top deck checker, you know, when you go into your first grade 3 turn and you see triggers, you don't want to use Totres, but if you don't have Hexaorb in your hand, you're not going to have as an effective follow-up, so it's a mixed bag there, but I also kind of like that at the same time, because let's say I don't see any triggers during that first grade 3 turn, I can call her down, use the counterblast, add the Hexaorb in my hand, make sure I have a follow-up, and then use my top deck checkers like Oline at that point, which increases my chance of checking a trigger right there. And then the other top deck kicker you get is Copperone, which Copperone is another really good grade 2, but not as good as she could have been. I really feel like she should have taken up what Tartan was doing, where for a Soul Blast, you can check the top 2 cards and put one on top of the deck and one on the bottom of the deck, but instead she just lets you rearrange them, which during your grade 2 turn, fantastic, because if you see a trigger as your second card, but not your first card, you can just switch them up, and during your grade 2 turn, you attack with like Copperone. They might take it at that point. They're going to guard the Vanguard because they don't want to get crit sacked. And then you give the effects to your third grade 2. And, you know, especially if you put like Painkiller behind it in order to create like a really powerful column, you might be swinging for like 28 with a crit. And they're either going to have to use a lot more cards from their hand to guard it, or they might take it, and that could easily put them at 3 damage right there, which is, at that point, checking 1 to 2 triggers could your next turn could easily gain you a lot of net advantage. So Copperone is great, but not as good as she could be. But because of the plus 5k shield, plus 2 attack during your grade 3 turn, she is very good from the deck. But she's not a card that should be at 4 in your deck. I personally run 3 and easily could get power crept out with the right support. But still good card. And then this is where 2 cards here kind of create, I consider it my engine. This is where it gets around a lot of the biggest things in the format. Because in set 3, retire formats were huge. And retiring is one of Hexaorb's other biggest weakness besides being able to draw cards and net advantage. So Nanafull is a grade 2 that says when trigger is checked, so another when trigger is checked card. Take a card from your hand, put it in your soul, and draw a card. So, you know, a lot of times I would find myself having a lot of triggers in my hand because that's all I'm checking, but no unit. So when my board gets retired by Basfragra, Gravidia, you know, Leonard taking them out, etc., I don't really have a follow-up because sometimes I draw a card, Persona Ride, draw another trigger. That's 2 triggers right there, and I have no units to call out, and I don't want to attack with triggers. So what she does is when you check a trigger, you take a card from your hand, let's say you have too many triggers, put one of the triggers in your soul and draw a card, and you may draw a unit, and that really helps you have a better follow-up turn, especially if almost every unit in your deck is a top deck checker. And that's where we get into the last good card, Hexaorb Angel, which for a single Soul Blast, you top deck attack your card. If it's, you can leave it on top of its trigger if you want to, or if it's a unit, you just call it straight out. You do have to call it behind her, which, is kind of unfortunate, but at the same time, you're putting more units on the board. That gets around Basagra, who blows up your front row, so that way you have a follow-up on your next turn. So while you're not necessarily adding it to your hand, you're still able to kind of plus off of that, which is really nice, and increase your chances of checking triggers, which I think is really cool, especially if you call it another top deck checker. And because you have a card like Nana Full helping you refill your soul, you can abuse Oline, Copperone, Hexaorb Angel, Hexaorb Soul, so you're really only using Counterblast for 2 cards in your deck. You're using the Counterblast for Hexaorb's Persona Ride ability, and you're using it for Dyeglass if you need it later on, and so you don't need to use it too much for that. There is an order that came out at this time called Wish for Tomorrow. I didn't like it as much as I wanted to. For a Counterblast Soul Blast, you get to look at the top card. You get to take a trigger, put on top. Before you do that, you get to draw a card, which again is a way to draw cards in the deck. But I just think orders, when sometimes you want to be able to have units, and that kind of hurts when you sometimes draw the order and you don't have like the Counterblast to use it or the resource to use it, and you really needed a unit, and so it kind of just becomes a brick in your hand. I'm kind of mixed when it comes to orders. I'm not the biggest fan of them. I think Hexaorb is best when you're calling out units. And that's where we get to the weird direction set 4 takes. A lot of decks went up in power for set 4, and in set 4 they printed more when trigger effects for Hexaorb instead of top deck checkers, and not cards that can do both. And a lot of these cards minus you instead of plussing or even going net advantage. The grade 1 is probably the most interesting one. That's Rita. For when you check a trigger, you're able to Counterblast 1, Soul Blast 1, retire her, and restand a unit, which multi-attacking, very, very important, but you're even losing the unit. I don't think that the retire was necessarily necessary, but that's a card I want to experiment. I think that's the one that has the most potential right now. And then you have the grade 3, which is Totres. When you check a trigger, whether it's a crit or a front, you get to activate one or both effects, which if you check a crit, you can bottom deck one of your opponent's units, which is really powerful, don't mind me. And then if you check a front, you can restand a grade 2. So between the two, the grade 1 and the grade 3, you can make 5 attacks. But if you look at it this way, Bastion can make 5 attacks by discarding just a Bastion from hand. And they're gaining 20k to each column. So you're talking about during a Persona Ride turn, you're counterblasting 3 times, you're soul blasting twice just to make 5 attacks when something like Bastion can just discard a card. Bruce can do 6 attacks by counterblasting 1 and soul blasting 5, and when that deck supercharges its soul. So that's one of the biggest disadvantages that Hexaorb has. And this goes into the grade 2, which I think is the only top deck checker in the next set, and it only does it on attack, which is not necessarily a problem, but the problem is you discard a card. Now, it does what Oline does. You can put both on top, both on bottom, one on top, one on bottom, but you lose a card, and through the playtesting I've done so far with the sneak peeks, that one card hurts a lot. Especially if you don't see Painkiller Angel and you're not drawing that card, you're really going into, especially if you try to use it in your grade 2 turn, you're really losing a lot of advantage. It's great that you don't have to use a counterblast. I see the appeal of the discard, but if you don't have a way of drawing a lot of cards, that hurts a lot. And that gets into the last card that I think that I wish this could have been on a unit, because it's an order called Fortune Reading. For a single counterblast, you get to look at the top card of your deck and you can put it top and bottom and draw a card. I know it's kind of backwards because you're not really ever being able to technically predict your draw. I mean, it could be counterblast and draw that card, which is really cool. You just basically top your card. Oh, cool. It's not a trigger. Let me add it to my hand. And that is a plus for a single counterblast. But I think it would have been better if it was on place if your Vanguard is Hexaorb Sorceress or Pentagleam, counterblast 1 with the top card of your deck and basically make the same skill. I think that Hexaorb needs a way of being able to plus, and this kind of gets into where can this deck go. we have these new cool draw triggers that Hexaorb isn't able to take advantage of because you need the criticals to apply pressure. You need the front triggers as your next best trigger, especially with a 20k shield. And so you can't draw like other decks do. And these other decks, while they can draw, they also now have the draw triggers, and they're going to have plus 10k shield on the draw triggers now. So they're going to have even better ability to guard against our offensive trigger attacks. So I would like to see units that, if you're going to do more when trigger effects, maybe have, like, when you check a trigger, Soul Blast 1 to draw a card. You know, at least you're using a resource. It's not just a free draw card, but if you can pay a resource to turn your critical trigger into also a draw trigger, I think it's a really cool way to have that sort of manipulation. I mean, you have a lot of units that can almost nearly guarantee a trigger. I really like that Hexaorb can put the trigger on top when you Persona Ride. I'm not even upset about having to gain triple drive that way instead of getting a grade 4, because I personally don't see us getting a grade 4 for Hexaorb. Going into set 5, it's not going to be an anime themed deck. I don't know if going into set 6 we're going to get grade 4s for the decks that aren't based off of the protagonist start decks, because if you look at the lyrical set, only Kairi is getting a grade 4 as far as we know. So, you know, does Hexaorb get a new Hexaorb even if it's a grade 3? We don't know what they're going to do yet. So my thought process is right now we need decks that either going to manipulate or when trigger check, but the when trigger checks need to be able to work with the deck. The fact that Totahone just bottom decks a unit when you check a crit and you got the counterblast user skill, I don't think it's as cohesive. If it was just when you check a trigger, counterblast 1, restand a grade 2, you could say that was a power creep version of Lapisto. I mean, it doesn't even have to gain power, just the ability to, oh, I know I'm going to check this trigger, let me use my counterblast to restand this unit to make it consistent for attacks. If Rita didn't retire herself, so that way Hexaorb has a continuous, you know, booster behind her, because personally, if we're going to have a grade 1 that retires itself, I think Painkiller for a single Soul Blast to draw card is a much more effective use of resources. And when I look at cards like Battle Sisters in V, you have cards that do interesting things, like Panatone. She says put herself into the soul, put a card from the top of your deck on bottom and one on top, and your next trigger gains plus 10k. She very much works like how Refluke does, except it's trigger manipulation still. And I think that'd be kind of interesting to have the ability that when you check a trigger, your opponent's going to be like, well, if it's a trigger, is this trigger going to be 30k? I think a card like this isn't necessarily too powerful for standard, where, you know, when you have cards like Trifle, who for a single counterblast check a top 3 to call out a card, and you can leave the rest top on top. Maybe top 3 is too powerful. You know, you could even have, I mean, Izrod kind of does it already, Soul Blast to call a unit to the rear guard, but you know, you could easily have a card that says check a top 2, call one out, leave one on top. And that's kind of interesting and something as well. I've also thought about this grade 1, the Casita, who when you check a trigger, she gains plus 10k. That one I'm a little bit more iffy. I think I'd rather see units that do things and not just gain power when triggers checked, but it is free, and that is something considering. If you look at what Token Rambu does, they have that grade 1 that when you put the trigger effects on it, it gains an extra 10k. While Token Rambu is not very good, that booster is actually kind of crazy, and I've lost against my friend Alex just because he checked that trigger. And he checked 2 triggers and he put like all the effects onto the booster for the power. So that was scary losing to that card. It was basically like Oline, but you don't have to like counterblast to do it. So it's free. So those are some interesting ways to go. I still love Hexaorb. I'm still going to play it in set 4, even though I think that if I end up losing a lot, I may just have to invest in playing Bastion, and I've already picked up some of the cards for that, and I have my Bastion core still, but Hexaorb is a deck that I'm very passionate about, at least until they do an Angel Ride line. Maybe we'll see something from set 6 for that. But like, I want to see this deck to continue to get support. I think it's really cool. I love Oracle Think Tank, and I think if the deck gets the, you know, if they want to go this route of when trigger effect goes without having the top deck manipulation, maybe we can see things that more cohesive or cost less resources or create consistency. I think that Nana Fool is kind of the right direction, where it refills the soul and you still get the draw card, so you're going card neutral advantage, +1 on a resource, which lets you use cards like Izrod, and in a way you can consider that a combo, and so that's where I'd love to see the deck goes. But anyways, that is my critical analysis of Hexaorb as it plays out in the standard format. If you want to see us do more like this for other decks that, you know, the other Vanguard boys are playing, let us know. I want to bring more interesting content and not just gameplay commentary as we head into 300 subs, which is my goal for the end of February, which we're really close on. So make sure you give that subscribe button a boom, boom, boom. like, and comment. And I think I'm going to set up a copy for the channel, which is, if you want to support us, we're going to use that to get some uniforms, use it to travel more events, and just like we did in Houston. And I want to start doing more team content. So thank you guys so much for the support. It's been really fun working on these videos for you guys, and just let us know what you want to see going into 2022.